The bullet entered Daniel Carter's back before he ever heard the gunshot. For one frozen second, he stood beneath the chandeliers of his own mansion, staring at the blood spreading across the front of his white shirt as if it belonged to someone else. Then his knees gave way. Around him, men he had trusted for 20 years calmly stepped over his body. His eldest son did not scream. His business partner did not call an ambulance. His second wife simply removed the diamond ring Daniel had bought her and placed it inside her purse. Only then did Daniel understand. The empire he had spent half a lifetime building had never truly belonged to him. The supermarkets, the warehouses, the transport companies, the apartment towers, the land stretching across 3 states. Every dollar he had earned through sleepless nights and broken bones had attracted wolves. And Daniel had been arrogant enough to believe that blood ties and loyalty could keep those wolves outside his door. His son crouched beside him. There was no grief in the young man's eyes, only impatience. "You should have retired when we told you." Daniel tried to laugh. Blood filled his mouth instead. He had started with nothing. At 17, he had unloaded flour sacks for 50 cents an hour. At 20, he slept inside a delivery truck because he could not afford rent. At 30, he owned 3 stores. At 50, newspapers called him one of the richest self-made businessmen in the country. And at 68, he discovered that the family fortune he had created had transformed his own family into executioners. His vision darkened. In those final seconds, Daniel did not think about money. He thought about a tiny wooden farmhouse. A woman with rough hands placing an extra potato into his bowl. A silent father coughing blood into a handkerchief while pretending everything was fine. 2 little sisters wearing patched dresses and smiling because their older brother had returned home with a single piece of candy. The year everything had begun. The year poverty tore his family apart. His father died because they could not afford treatment. His mother sold her wedding ring for food. His youngest sister vanished after being sent to live with distant relatives. Daniel had escaped that miserable life and spent decades becoming rich, but wealth had arrived far too late to save the people who had once mattered. As death closed around him, one thought burned hotter than the bullet lodged beside his heart. If he could return to that year, he would do everything differently. He would never abandon them. He would never waste 30 years chasing money after the people he loved were already buried. He would build the fortune sooner, faster, and this time, every wolf who tried to touch his family would lose its teeth. Then the mansion disappeared. Daniel opened his eyes to the smell of smoke, damp wood, and boiled cabbage. For several seconds, he could not move. Rain tapped against a thin window. Wind slipped through cracks in the walls. Somewhere nearby, a rusty stove hissed. His body felt strange, light, painfully young. Daniel raised his hands. No liver spots, no gold watch. His fingers were thin, covered in small cuts and old calluses. He stumbled from the narrow bed and nearly collided with a cracked mirror hanging beside the door. The face staring back at him was 17 years old. Black hair, sharp cheekbones, a bruise beneath the left eye. Daniel stopped breathing. He knew that bruise. He had received it after fighting 2 boys over a loaf of bread. He slowly turned toward the calendar nailed to the wooden wall. October 18, 1975. His legs weakened. Daniel grabbed the table. Outside this room, someone coughed. 3 short coughs. Then one deep, terrible wheeze. His father. Daniel rushed through the doorway. The kitchen was barely larger than a closet. His mother stood over a pot, slicing 1 potato into pieces so thin they were almost transparent. His father sat near the stove wrapped in an old military jacket. At the table, 12-year-old Emily carefully divided a crust of bread with 8-year-old Rose. Daniel stared at them. His mother was young. His father still had color in his face. His sisters were here, alive. "Danny?" His mother looked frightened. "What happened?" Daniel crossed the room and hugged her so hard. The knife almost slipped from her hand. Everyone froze. Daniel had not hugged his mother since he was a child, not in this life, not in the previous one. For him, it had been more than 50 years. He buried his face against her shoulder. She smelled exactly as he remembered. Soap. Flower home. His mother slowly touched his hair. "Are you sick?" Daniel laughed through tears. "No." He looked around the kitchen. "I think I finally woke up." Nobody understood what he meant. That was fine. Daniel did. He remembered this month perfectly. His father's condition would worsen in 11 days. 3 weeks later, he would collapse while cutting timber. The local clinic would recommend treatment in the city. The family would have no money. By Christmas, his father would be dead. Then everything would begin falling apart. Daniel looked toward the small cabinet near the stove. Inside, it was the entire Carter family fortune. $10.37. His mother had saved it for winter coal. In his first life, that money had disappeared within 2 weeks. This time, Daniel intended to turn it into something no one in this house could imagine. He stepped outside before sunrise. Cold air struck his face. Their farm sat beyond the edge of Millbrook, a fading rural town surrounded by forest, abandoned fields, and miles of dirt roads. Daniel remembered every economic change that would transform the region: the highway extension, the industrial park, the suburban expansion. Land worth almost nothing today would become extremely valuable. But that would take years. His Daniel needed cash now, fast cash. He walked toward the old barn, planning every possible opportunity he could remember. Then something impossible happened. As his hand touched the barn door, the world twisted. There was no warning, no flash of lightning. One moment, Daniel stood beneath a gray October sky. The next, he stood barefoot in warm black soil beneath a brilliant golden sun. He froze. Before him stretched an enormous field. Green grass moved beneath a wind he could not feel. A crystal-clear stream curved through the land. Beyond it stood fruit trees heavy with apples, pears, peaches, and oranges, crops that should never have been growing in the same climate. At the center of the field stood a small wooden cabin. Daniel walked toward it cautiously. Inside were shelves, farming tools, several empty storage rooms, and a stone basin filled with clear water. Nothing explained where he was. But Daniel understood one thing immediately. This place was not part of Millbrook. He touched the cabin wall. The world twisted again. Daniel found himself standing outside the barn. His heart slammed against his ribs. He looked down. Still holding his breath, he imagined the mysterious field. Instantly, he returned. Daniel spent the next hour testing it. He could enter whenever he focused on the place. He could leave whenever he wished. More importantly, objects could travel with him. A rock from Millbrook appeared inside the mysterious land. An apple from the orchard returned with him. Then Daniel discovered something even more terrifying. Time behaved differently. He placed several damp shirts beside the stream, returned home, and waited 10 minutes. When he entered again, the shirts were completely dry. He planted a handful of bean seeds inside the black soil. After leaving the space for less than an hour, he returned to find green shoots pushing from the ground. Daniel crouched beside them. His hands trembled. In his first life, he had spent decades learning supply agriculture, retail, property, negotiation, pricing, logistics, and investment. Now he had returned to 1975 with 50 years of business experience inside a 17-year-old body, and someone had handed him land where crops grew at impossible speed. Daniel began laughing, quietly at first, then harder. He laughed until tears entered his eyes. $10? He no longer needed $10 to become rich. He needed $10 to open the first door. That morning, Daniel borrowed his father's bicycle and rode into Millbrook. The town grocery store sold potatoes for 18 cents a pound. Apples cost nearly twice that. Fresh vegetables were limited because several local farms had suffered a poor harvest. Daniel noticed the owner arguing with a supplier beside the loading entrance. Half the tomatoes in the supplier's crates were bruised. The lettuce had already begun wilting. Daniel smiled. There it was, his first opportunity. He rode home and asked his mother for $5. Her face changed immediately. $5? It's for business. We have 10, I know. That money is for coal. Daniel met her eyes. If I lose it, I'll work every day this winter and replace it. His father coughed from the table. You have a business? Not yet, Daniel smiled. But I have a buyer. That was a lie, for now. His mother refused twice. His father remained silent. Finally, the older man opened the cabinet and removed a wrinkled $5 bill. He placed it on the table. $5 is a lot of money to this family. Daniel nodded. I know. His father pushed it toward him, so bring back 6. Daniel took the money. I'll bring back more. At the agricultural store, Daniel bought inexpensive seeds. Tomatoes, carrots, green beans, strawberries. He spent $4.68. 32 cents remained. The clerk looked at the skinny teenager with amusement. You starting a farm in October? Daniel smiled. Something like that. Before evening, every seed was planted inside the mysterious land. By the next morning, the lettuce had grown enough to harvest. The tomatoes were flowering. The strawberries already carried small green fruit. Daniel harvested several heads of lettuce. They were flawless, crisp, bright, large, not a single insect mark. He carried them into town inside 2 wooden crates borrowed from the barn. The grocery owner stared at the produce. Where'd you steal these? In October? Greenhouse. Daniel answered without hesitation. The man lifted one lettuce head. You have more? How much do you need? The owner looked toward the spoiled vegetables near his loading area. 20 heads tomorrow. Daniel deliberately hesitated. He had learned long ago that appearing too eager weakened your price. I can do 15. The owner named a price. Daniel shook his head. The man increased it. Daniel refused again. They argued for 6 minutes. Daniel walked away twice. On the third offer, he accepted. His first sale earned him $4.50. It was almost the same amount he had invested in seeds. But the seeds were still producing. That changed everything. The following morning, Daniel delivered lettuce and strawberries. The strawberries caused an argument inside the store because customers could not believe their quality. By afternoon, every box was gone. The owner wanted twice as much. Daniel increased the price. 3 days later, he had $38. A week later, he had $112. He told his parents that a nearby greenhouse owner had hired him as a commission salesman. It was safer than explaining magical farmland. His mother stared at the bills Daniel placed on the kitchen table. His father counted them twice. Emily whispered. Daniel almost laughed. Not yet. But for the Carter family of 1975, $100 felt like treasure. Daniel took $40 and bought coal. He bought meat, real meat. He bought eggs, flour, milk, medicine, and a new pair of shoes for Rose. His mother cried when she saw the groceries. His father turned away so nobody would notice his eyes. Daniel said nothing. This was why he had returned. Not skyscrapers, not luxury cars. Not magazine covers, this, a warm kitchen. Food on the table. His little sister wearing shoes without holes. But Daniel knew happiness could disappear quickly. His father was still sick. And there were people in Millbrook who had begun noticing that a poor 17-year-old boy was suddenly selling the best produce in the county. One of them was Harold Briggs. Briggs controlled nearly half the agricultural trade around Millbrook. He owned trucks, warehouses, cold storage. He also loaned money to desperate farmers and took their land when they could not repay. Daniel knew the name. In his previous life, Harold Briggs had bought the Carter farm 6 months after Daniel's father died, for almost nothing. Daniel had hated him for decades. Now, on the 9th morning after his rebirth, Daniel walked out of the grocery store carrying $87 from another delivery and saw a black pickup parked across the street. Harold Briggs leaned against the hood, 40 years old. Heavy coat, gold watch, a cigar between his fingers. 2 men stood behind him. Briggs smiled. So you're the Carter boy. Daniel stopped. Memories of his mother signing away their farm flashed through his mind. Briggs slowly approached. I hear you've got yourself a little vegetable business. Daniel said nothing. Briggs looked at the money in Daniel's hand. Then he smiled wider. You know, this town already has suppliers. Daniel folded the bills and placed them inside his pocket. I noticed. Briggs's smile disappeared. You should also notice what happens to people who compete with me. Daniel looked at the 2 men behind him. Then at Briggs. In his first life, Daniel had been 17 when this man destroyed what remained of his family. Back then, he had been powerless, hungry, afraid. Today, he had 5 decades of experience, a hidden world full of impossible crops, and the memory of exactly how Harold Briggs would eventually lose everything. Daniel stepped closer. So that's why you came? Briggs narrowed his eyes. To scare a kid? For the first time, the older man looked uncertain. Daniel smiled. Then you should have brought more men. Across the street, the grocery owner stopped unloading boxes. People began watching. Briggs dropped his cigar onto the ground and crushed it beneath his boot. Careful, boy. Daniel's smile never changed. Because he suddenly remembered something Briggs did not know. In exactly 6 days, Harold Briggs would desperately need $50,000. And Daniel knew why. More importantly, he knew which piece of land Briggs would be forced to sell. A worthless swamp beside the old county road. Worthless in 1975, but not for long. Daniel walked past him. Briggs grabbed his shoulder. Daniel stopped. The entire street seemed to become silent. Slowly, Daniel looked down at Briggs's hand, then back into the man's eyes. You have 6 days, Daniel said. Briggs frowned. For what? Daniel removed the hand from his shoulder. To decide how much of your future you want to sell me. Then he walked away, leaving the most powerful businessman in Millbrook, staring after a penniless 17-year-old who, as far as anyone knew, owned nothing but an old bicycle. What none of them understood was that Daniel Carter had already lived through the next 50 years. He knew which companies would rise, which banks would fail, which roads would be built, which land would become priceless, which shortages would strike, which industries would explode. And hidden behind the walls of an ordinary barn, He possessed something even more valuable than knowledge of the future. A world where seasons meant nothing, where food could grow faster than money could be printed, where every seed was a potential fortune. Daniel reached into his pocket and touched the $87 he had earned that morning. $10 had already become more than 100. Soon 100 would become 1,000. 1,000 would become land. Land would become warehouses. Warehouses would become stores. And stores would become an empire. But before Daniel could build any of that, he had one debt from his previous life to settle. His father coughed blood that night, and when Daniel saw the red stain on the handkerchief, he knew the countdown had begun. 6 days to destroy Harold Briggs' first trap, 11 days to save his father's life, and only one chance to rewrite the fate of the Carter family forever. Daniel did not sleep that night. His father's bloody handkerchief lay folded inside a metal basin near the stove. But even after everyone went to bed, Daniel could still see the stain. In his previous life, he had seen the same thing. Back then, he had been frightened but useless. He remembered standing beside the kitchen door, while his mother whispered with his father about hospital costs. He remembered pretending not to hear when his father said they could not spend money they did not have. Most clearly of all, Daniel remembered the funeral. Frozen soil, cheap pine. His mother standing beneath falling snow with a face so empty that Daniel had barely recognized her. Not again. Before dawn, Daniel entered the magic space. The impossible field remained warm beneath the golden light. His crops had multiplied again. Rows of tomatoes hung heavy on vines. Strawberries covered the ground like scattered rubies. Lettuce stood thick and crisp. The bean plants had climbed their supports so quickly that Daniel could barely believe he had planted them only days earlier. But tonight he was not interested in vegetables. He walked to the stone basin inside the wooden cabin. The water inside it was perfectly still. Daniel had already noticed something strange about the basin. The water never decreased. No matter how much he removed, the surface slowly returned to the same level. He had tasted it once. It was cool and slightly sweet. After drinking it, the exhaustion from an entire day of cycling and carrying crates had disappeared within an hour. At first, Daniel had assumed it was psychological. Now he needed to know. He filled a bottle. The next morning, he poured a small amount into his father's tea. His father drank without noticing. An hour later, the older man stopped coughing. By lunchtime, some color had returned to his cheeks. Daniel watched him carefully. His father noticed. "What? You look better." The man touched his chest. "Feels better." Daniel's heart began pounding. He did not dare celebrate. The magic water might help, but he had no idea what disease his father actually had. He needed a doctor, a real one, and that required money. Daniel left home before 8. Instead of going directly to the grocery store, he rode toward the northern edge of Millbrook. There, behind an abandoned lumber yard, stood an old warehouse owned by a man named Samuel Price. Daniel remembered Price. In 1975, everyone considered him a failure. His warehouse business was almost bankrupt. His wife had left him. Banks refused to lend him money. 3 years later, Samuel Price would move west, invest in refrigeration equipment, and eventually build one of the largest cold chain distribution companies in the region. Daniel had met him decades later. By then, Price was worth millions. More importantly, the old man had once told Daniel exactly how close he had come to giving up. October 1975, this month. Daniel pushed open the warehouse office door. A thin man in his early 30s sat behind a desk covered with overdue invoices. Samuel looked up. "We're closed." "I need storage," Samuel laughed. "You own something worth storing?" "Food." That caught his attention. Daniel placed a tomato on the desk. Samuel picked it up. Deep red color. "Greenhouse?" Daniel nodded. "Family operation. How much? Enough to need space." Samuel leaned back. "You don't need a warehouse for 2 baskets of tomatoes." Daniel smiled. "Come outside." Behind the warehouse stood 20 wooden crates Daniel had secretly moved from the magic space into an abandoned shed before sunrise. Samuel stopped walking when he saw them. Tomatoes, lettuce, beans, apples. Every crate looked as though it had been harvested minutes ago. Samuel turned. "Where the hell did all this come from?" "My problem." Daniel pointed at the warehouse. "Your problem is empty storage." Samuel's eyes narrowed. Daniel continued. "I pay cash. You give me one corner and keep your mouth shut." "How much cash?" Daniel offered $12 a month. Samuel almost laughed. Daniel waited. The man looked at the empty warehouse behind him. $12 was 12 more than that section currently earned. 20, 15, 18. 16 and I bring more business. Samuel stared at the 17-year-old. You negotiate like an old bastard. Daniel smiled. I've had good teachers. They shook hands. That single agreement changed Daniel's operation. Until now, he had been limited by how much produce he could carry on a bicycle. The warehouse gave him a staging point. The next obstacle was transportation. Daniel found that solution the same afternoon. Frank Miller owned an aging Ford pickup and spent most days delivering furniture, firewood, and whatever else people paid him to haul. Daniel offered him $5 for a morning delivery route. Frank asked where the produce came from. Daniel gave him the same answer he gave everyone. Frank did not care. Cash was enough. The following morning, Daniel supplied not one grocery store but four. By evening, he had earned $73. The day after that, $106. Then $139. His business began moving faster than Daniel had expected. The quality of the produce did most of the work. Customers noticed, store owners noticed, restaurant owners noticed, and Harold Briggs definitely noticed. On the fourth day, one of Daniel's deliveries vanished. Frank arrived at the warehouse furious. Someone slashed 2 tires. Daniel walked outside. Both rear tires were ruined. No robbery, no warning note, just damage. Frank cursed. Daniel crouched beside the truck. In his previous life, violence had frightened him. Now it merely gave him information. Briggs was nervous. That was good. A nervous man made mistakes. Daniel paid Frank for the tires. Frank stared at him. That's $40. I know, you got $40? Daniel handed him 50 for the trouble. Frank's anger disappeared. Loyalty was sometimes complicated. Sometimes it cost $10. That evening, Daniel rode directly to Harold Briggs's office. The building stood beside a large grain warehouse near the railway. Briggs sat behind an oak desk smoking a cigar. He smiled when Daniel entered. Lose something today? Daniel closed the door. Briggs raised an eyebrow. Daniel placed a folded newspaper on the desk. The article concerned a regional construction company called Mercer Development. Briggs glanced at it. What is this? Your problem? Briggs leaned back. You have 30 seconds before I throw you out. Daniel pointed toward the newspaper. Mercer owes you $48,000. The smile vanished from Briggs's face. Daniel continued. They promised payment from the sale of their Riverside project. Briggs's eyes sharpened. How do you know that? Daniel ignored the question. The sale collapses on Monday. That was the event Daniel remembered. In his first life, the failure of Mercer Development had triggered a chain reaction through Millbrook. Briggs had financed the company privately. When Mercer collapsed, Briggs suddenly needed cash to cover loans attached to his own warehouses. That pressure forced him to sell several properties. One of them was the swamp beside County Road 9. Briggs stood. Who told you? Nobody. Then you're guessing. Daniel smiled. Call Mercer. For the first time, Briggs looked genuinely uneasy. Daniel turned toward the door. Monday afternoon, you'll need money. Suppose I do. Daniel stopped. I'll buy the County Road property. Briggs laughed. Yes. With what? Cash. You don't have enough money to buy my truck. Then selling me worthless swampland should be easy. Briggs' expression hardened. That property is worth $8,000. Daniel almost laughed. In 4 years, the new highway interchange would be announced less than half a mile from that land. Within 8 years, developers would pay more than $300,000 for it. But today, nobody wanted it. 2,000. Briggs slammed his hand on the desk. Get out. Daniel opened the door. Then he left. Briggs shouted after him. Daniel never looked back. He did not need Briggs to accept today. He needed Briggs desperate. When Daniel returned home, his mother was waiting beside the stove. His father was sitting upright. That alone surprised him. The man had eaten 2 full bowls of soup. His coughing had almost disappeared. Daniel touched the bottle hidden inside his coat. The spring water was working, but something else had changed. His father looked at him differently. Not suspiciously, proudly. There's someone here to see you, his mother said. Daniel turned. A man in a gray coat sat near the kitchen window. Dr. Henry Collins. Daniel recognized him immediately. The town physician had treated his family when he was a child. Daniel's mother spoke quietly. I asked him to look at your father. Daniel felt relief. Good. Collins examined him for almost half an hour. When he finished, his face was serious. His lungs are weak. There may be an infection. But I want tests done at the hospital. Daniel asked the only question that mattered. How much? His mother lowered her eyes. Collins hesitated. Tests, travel, medication, perhaps 150 more if he needs treatment. Daniel's father immediately shook his head. No. Daniel turned toward him. His father spoke firmly. We aren't spending that. In his first life, those exact words had helped kill him. Daniel walked to his room. He returned carrying a metal box. Then he emptied it onto the kitchen table. Bills covered the wood. His mother gasped. His father stared. $386. More cash than the Carter family had seen together in years. Daniel pushed it toward his mother. Take him tomorrow. Nobody spoke. His father looked from the money to Daniel. Where did you get this? Selling vegetables? All this? Yes, his father shook his head slowly. I don't understand. Daniel leaned forward. You don't need to, his voice softened. You spent 17 years keeping this family alive. Let me carry something now. His father's eyes became wet. He looked away. Daniel pretended not to notice. The next morning, his parents left for the hospital. Daniel watched the bus disappear down the road. Then he turned toward Millbrook. It was Monday, the day Mercer Development collapsed. At 11:43, the news reached town. At 12:15, Briggs called the bank. At 1:30, the bank refused to extend his credit. At 2:10, Daniel walked into Briggs' office. The cigar in Briggs' hand had burned almost to his fingers. The older man looked 20 years older than he had 4 days earlier. Daniel placed $2,000 on the desk. Briggs stared at the money. It had taken Daniel nearly every dollar he had raised, plus advance payments from 2 grocery stores and a restaurant. It was reckless, but Daniel knew the future. Sometimes certainty looked exactly like recklessness to people who did not possess it. Briggs whispered, 3,000, 2,500, 2,000. Briggs glared at him. Daniel began gathering the money. Wait, Daniel stopped. Briggs clenched his jaw. You think you're clever? No. Daniel looked into his eyes. I think you're broke. That hurt. Daniel could see it. Briggs signed. 30 minutes later, Daniel Carter walked out of the county records office, owning 32 acres beside County Road 9. People laughed when they heard. The Carter boy had spent $2,000 on swamp. Briggs laughed loudest. Daniel let them. Because buried inside his memory was a newspaper headline from 1979. State approves new interstate connector through Millbrook District. And the proposed interchange would sit almost directly across from Daniel's new property. $2,000 would become hundreds of thousands, eventually millions. But Daniel did not have 4 years to celebrate. When he returned to Samuel Price's warehouse that evening, he found the front door hanging open. Broken crates covered the floor. Tomatoes had been crushed beneath boots. Bags of vegetables had been cut apart. Samuel stood in the middle of the destruction, blood running from his nose. Daniel's expression became cold. Briggs Samuel spat blood onto the floor. 3 men. Daniel said nothing. They told me to stop working with you. Daniel walked slowly through the ruined produce. A week earlier, he might have viewed it as a loss. Now he saw something else. Permission. Briggs had crossed the line first. Daniel looked toward Samuel. Do you still want to work with me? Samuel stared at him. You see what they did? Yes. They'll come back, I know. Samuel wiped his face. You're 17 years old. What exactly are you planning to do? Daniel looked at the broken crates. Then he smiled. Not the smile of a teenager. The smile of a man who had spent 50 years watching competitors destroy themselves because they mistook patience for weakness. I'm going to make Harold Briggs sell me the rest. Samuel frowned. The rest of what? Daniel looked toward the grain warehouses visible beyond the window. Everything. And at that exact moment, a truck pulled into the yard. Not Frank's truck, a much larger vehicle. On its side was the name of the biggest restaurant supplier in the county. The driver stepped down and walked toward Daniel, holding a purchase order. The amount printed at the bottom was larger than every sale Daniel had made combined. Someone had tasted his strawberries in the city, and they wanted 500 pounds a week. Daniel stared at the order. The magic space had just given him the weapon he needed. Harold Briggs thought he was fighting a poor farm boy. By tomorrow morning, Daniel intended to show him what happened when a poor farm boy controlled a supply that no ordinary farm on earth could match. 500 pounds a week. Samuel read the purchase order 3 times. Then he looked at Daniel as though the boy had somehow dragged a gold mine into the warehouse. You can actually supply this? Daniel took the paper from his hands. I can supply more. Samuel gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Do you understand what this means? Daniel understood better than he could possibly explain. The company printed across the top of the order was Harrison Food Distribution, one of the largest restaurant suppliers in the county. In 1975, Harrison was still modest by regional standards, but Daniel remembered what happened later. Hotels, restaurants, school cafeterias, hospitals. Eventually, Harrison would supply half the state. A relationship with them was not merely another customer. It was a doorway. And Harold Briggs had just smashed Daniel's warehouse on the same night that doorway opened. Daniel folded the purchase order. How soon do they want the first delivery? Samuel pointed toward the bottom. Thursday. 3 days. Daniel smiled. Good. Samuel looked around at the ruined crates. Good. Daniel stepped over the smashed tomatoes. Because Briggs thinks this is my entire inventory. That night, after Samuel left, Daniel locked the warehouse and entered the magic space. The fields had changed again. Every time he harvested one area and replanted it, growth seemed to accelerate. The soil remained dark and rich, the stream never dried. The fruit trees continued producing with impossible abundance. Daniel had started experimenting with the spring water as well. Seeds soaked in it germinated faster. Plants watered with it grew stronger. Damaged vegetables recovered firmness after several hours inside the space. It was not simply fertile land. It was a production machine that ignored ordinary agricultural limits. Daniel walked through the rows calculating yield. 500 pounds a week sounded enormous to Samuel. To Daniel, it was almost nothing. The problem was no longer growing food. The problem was explaining where it came from. Too much supply appearing too quickly would attract questions. Tax officials, competitors, agricultural inspectors, maybe even journalists. A miracle was useful only while nobody knew it was a miracle. Daniel needed land, real workers, real barns, real records, a legitimate business large enough to hide impossible production inside ordinary production. He suddenly understood his next move. Harold Briggs had warehouses, trucks, contracts, farm relationships, distribution routes. Daniel did not need to build that infrastructure. He could take Briggs's. The following morning, Millbrook woke to a rumor. Someone had placed an anonymous call to 3 farmers claiming Harold Briggs was in financial trouble. By 9 o'clock, 6 farmers were standing outside Briggs' agricultural supply demanding payment for produce delivered the previous month. By 11, the suppliers were calling. By noon, 2 creditors arrived. Daniel had not invented anything. He had merely told the truth earlier than Briggs wanted it known. In business, information could be more destructive than fire. Briggs spent the day denying everything. He called the rumors malicious. He told farmers that Mercer Development's collapse had no effect on him. He promised everyone would be paid. Then one of his checks bounced. That was enough. Panic spread. Daniel sat inside Samuel's office, drinking coffee while the telephone rang. One farmer wanted to know whether Daniel was buying potatoes. Another had onions. A third had 20 crates of cabbage Briggs suddenly refused to take. Daniel bought selectively. Not because he needed the produce. He needed relationships. He paid cash immediately. By sunset, 12 farmers who had sold exclusively through Briggs were willing to sell to Daniel. Samuel watched the names accumulate in a notebook. You planned this, Daniel continued writing. I reacted, Daniel smiled. Samuel leaned against the desk. Who are you, a vegetable salesman? You're 17, so I've been told. Samuel shook his head. Then he pointed toward the warehouse yard. You've got another problem. 2 sheriff's cars had pulled in. Daniel went outside. Deputy Lawson stepped from the first vehicle. Daniel remembered him. Lawson was not corrupt, but he was cautious, and caution often favored powerful men. Daniel Carter? Yes. Harold Briggs filed a complaint. For what? Business interference. Threats, property theft. Daniel almost admired the desperation. Which property did I steal? Lawson looked uncomfortable. He says several commercial clients are receiving goods purchased through his distribution network. Daniel held out his hands. Then arrest me. The deputy stared at him. If he has proof. Lawson did not move. There was no proof, because nothing had been stolen. Daniel had simply sold better produce at better reliability. Briggs wanted the badge to frighten him. It would have worked on the 17-year-old Daniel from the first timeline. That boy had feared authority. This Daniel had negotiated bank acquisitions, fought corporate lawsuits, and sat across conference tables from men who controlled billions. A deputy carrying another man's complaint did not frighten him. Lawson lowered his voice. You should be careful. With the law, with Briggs. Daniel looked toward town. He should be careful with me. The deputy studied him for several seconds, then returned to his vehicle. By Thursday morning, Harrison Food Distribution's truck arrived. Daniel had prepared exactly what they ordered. Tomatoes, beans, strawberries, apples. Every crate was weighed. Every invoice was clean. Every vegetable looked perfect. The Harrison buyer was a broad-shouldered woman named Margaret Hill. She inspected the first crate in silence. Then the second, then the strawberries. She bit into one. Her expression changed. Where are you growing these? Family variety. Daniel named an ordinary commercial variety. Margaret took another strawberry. These don't taste ordinary. Daniel shrugged. Good soil, she laughed. I want to meet whoever owns that soil. You're looking at him. Margaret looked Daniel up and down. You? Yes, you're a kid. And the strawberries? She smiled. They're excellent. Then my age shouldn't affect the invoice. Samuel nearly choked behind him. Margaret stared at Daniel for a moment, then laughed loudly. I like you. She signed the delivery receipt. The payment was $740. Daniel felt nothing when he saw the number. Samuel almost stopped breathing. $740 from one delivery. The Carter family had once worried about $10 for coal. Now Daniel had earned more in a morning than many local workers made in weeks. But the true value was not the check. Margaret reached into her truck and brought back another document. If you can maintain quality, we want twice this amount next week. Daniel took the paper. Done, and we may add potatoes and onions. Done. You haven't heard quantities. Daniel smiled. Doesn't matter. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You're confident? No. Daniel folded the order. I'm prepared. By evening, the news had reached Briggs. Daniel knew because Briggs appeared at the warehouse personally. No bodyguards this time. No cigar. His face was pale with fury. Samuel stood near the office door holding a wrench. Daniel told him to put it down. Briggs stopped several feet away. You think you won? Daniel looked at him. No, you took Harrison. They chose me. You stole my farmers. I paid your farmers. You spread rumors about my business. Daniel smiled slightly. Were they false? Briggs's jaw tightened. That silence answered everything. Daniel walked toward him. Sell me the Eastern warehouse. Briggs stared, then laughed. You're insane. Maybe. That property is worth $15,000. Not with the lien. The laughter disappeared. Daniel had remembered that too. Briggs had used the Eastern warehouse as collateral for a short-term commercial loan. The note came due next month. Briggs stepped closer. How do you know about that? Daniel ignored him. $4,000. You bought swampland from me 3 days ago, and now you think you can buy my warehouse? Yes. $4,000 doesn't even cover half its value. It covers more than what the bank gives you after foreclosure. Briggs' face turned red. Daniel continued calmly. You need cash. Your suppliers know it. Your farmers know it. Your bank knows it. By next week, your customers will know it. Briggs pointed a finger at his chest. I built this business before you were born, and now you're losing it to someone who was born after you built it. Samuel looked away to hide a smile. Briggs saw it. That humiliation broke something inside him. He swung, the punch came fast. Daniel had expected it. Briggs's fist missed his jaw. Daniel caught the older man's wrist, twisted, and drove him chest first against the warehouse wall. Briggs grunted. Daniel leaned close. His voice became quiet. You already sent men here, Briggs struggled. You already destroyed my property. Daniel tightened his grip. You already used the sheriff to scare me. Briggs stopped moving. Daniel's words were almost a whisper. That was 3 mistakes. He released him. Briggs turned, breathing heavily. Daniel straightened his coat. Do not make a fourth. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Briggs spat on the floor. You'll regret this. Daniel watched him walk away. Perhaps Briggs believed he had delivered a threat. Daniel heard something else, fear. The next few days became a storm of growth. Daniel expanded deliveries. Samuel hired 2 workers. Frank began driving full-time. 3 nearby stores signed weekly agreements. A hotel in the city requested samples. A bakery wanted strawberries. A restaurant wanted tomatoes. Money began arriving faster than Daniel could hide it beneath his mattress. So he opened a bank account. The manager stared at his age. Daniel placed $1,600 on the desk. The manager stopped caring. At home, life changed more quietly. There was food every day. Rose gained weight. Emily received a proper winter coat. His mother stopped counting potatoes before cooking dinner. And his father returned from the hospital with news that made Daniel close his eyes in relief. The doctors had found a serious lung infection, but it had not progressed as badly as expected. Medication could treat it. Rest would help. The doctor had even seemed surprised by his recent improvement. Daniel knew why. Every morning, his father's tea contained water from the magic spring. He never used too much. He did not know what the water could do or whether sudden recovery would attract attention. Slow healing was safer. His father sat beside the stove that evening, holding the hospital papers. You saved my life. Daniel shook his head. The doctors did. His father looked at him. We both know that isn't what I mean. Daniel remained silent. The older man reached into his jacket and placed something on the table. A small brass key. Daniel recognized it, the barn key. His father had always kept it. What's this farm? Daniel frowned. His father continued. I can't work like before. Maybe I never will. Daniel started to speak. His father raised a hand. You've done more in 2 weeks than I managed in 2 years. There was no bitterness in his voice, only pride. This family needs someone who knows where he's going. Daniel looked at the key. In his previous life, his father had died, believing he had failed his family. Now he was alive, sitting here, trusting Daniel with the farm. For the first time since returning, Daniel nearly lost control of himself. He closed his fingers around the key. I'm not selling it. His father smiled faintly. I didn't ask you to. I mean, ever. Daniel looked around the room. This house, the barn, the fields. Nobody takes them from us. His father nodded slowly. All right. Daniel's voice hardened. And someday, everything around them will belong to us too. His mother laughed from the stove. Don't get greedy, Daniel smiled. If only she knew. 2 weeks after starting with $5 in seeds, Daniel controlled almost $3,000 in cash and inventory. He owned 32 acres. He supplied stores and restaurants. His father was recovering. His family was safe for the moment. Then Samuel arrived at the farmhouse after dark. He did not knock normally. He hammered the door. Daniel opened it. Samuel's face was white. What happened? The warehouse? No. Samuel shook his head. Daniel's eyes narrowed. What about it? They're calling my loan. Daniel went still. Samuel's warehouse had debt. Daniel knew that. But in the original timeline, the bank had not seized it until later. Something had changed. Daniel's actions were already altering history. Samuel handed him a letter. They say I have 72 hours to pay $9,000. Or they take the property. $9,000. Daniel had barely 3. Samuel sank into a chair. I'm finished. Daniel read the letter again. The bank was First Millbrook Commercial. The president was Thomas Vale. Daniel remembered that name too. And suddenly he understood. Briggs could not beat Daniel's supply. He could not scare away Daniel's customers. So he had attacked the one thing Daniel still depended on. Samuel looked up. What do we do? Daniel slowly folded the letter. We buy the warehouse. Samuel stared at him. With what money? Daniel looked toward the dark window. $9,000 in 72 hours. For the first time since his rebirth, the magic space alone could not solve the problem. He could grow a mountain of vegetables. But vegetables were not cash until someone bought them. Then Daniel remembered an event from the winter of 1975. A brutal cold front would strike the region early. Not next month, not next week, tomorrow night. Temperatures would plunge. Ordinary farms would lose what remained of their late harvest. Produce prices would spike across the county. Stores would panic. Restaurants would scramble for supply. And Daniel controlled the only farmland in existence that winter could never touch. He looked at Samuel. Open the warehouse tomorrow morning. Samuel frowned. The bank could take it. Not before the deadline. Daniel's eyes became cold. Call every grocery store, restaurant, hotel, and distributor within 50 miles. And tell them what? Daniel smiled. Tell them not to worry about the freeze. Samuel stared at him. What freeze? Outside, the night air was still mild. The forecast had mentioned nothing unusual. Daniel opened the door and looked toward the clear sky. In 24 hours, everyone in this county is going to need food. He turned back. And we're going to be the only people who have it. The temperature began falling at 3 in the afternoon. By sunset, Millbrook had stopped laughing at Daniel Carter. A wind rolled down from the north with such violence that doors slammed against their frames and loose signs tore free from storefronts. Water froze inside shallow troughs. The last green leaves curled beneath a sudden crust of ice. By midnight, the thermometer outside the Carter farmhouse had fallen far below anything predicted. Daniel stood beside the barn door, listening to the wind scream across the fields. He remembered this night. In his first life, the freeze had destroyed nearly every remaining autumn crop in the county. Families had complained about expensive vegetables for weeks. Daniel had remembered the inconvenience. Only after returning to 1975 did he understand the opportunity hidden inside it. He entered the magic space. Warm air touched his face. Inside, there was no winter. No frost, no darkness. The golden sky remained unchanged. Rows of vegetables stretched across the black soil in perfect health. Daniel had spent the entire previous day planting almost every seed he could buy without attracting suspicion. Potatoes, carrots, cabbage, beans, tomatoes, strawberries. He had even experimented with corn. Everything grew. Everything multiplied. And now the outside world had just lost a substantial portion of its supply. Daniel did not celebrate the suffering of farmers. He knew what ruined crops meant to poor families. That was exactly why he had already made a decision. He would raise prices. But not enough to become a parasite. He wanted profit. He also wanted loyalty. In his first life, Daniel had learned that a customer who remembered you during a crisis was worth 10 customers acquired through advertising. Before sunrise, Frank arrived at Samuel's warehouse wearing 2 coats. You really knew. Daniel was loading crates. Knew what? The freeze. I watched the weather. Frank stared at him. The radio didn't. Daniel handed him a clipboard. First delivery goes to Harrison. Frank looked at the crates. You have all this, apparently. Frank stopped asking questions. That was another thing Daniel liked about him. At 7:15, Harrison Food Distribution called. Margaret Hill did not bother with greetings. How much can you get me? How much do you need? Everything. Daniel smiled. That isn't a number. Margaret gave him one. Daniel almost laughed. It was more than 4 times their previous order. I can deliver half today. There was silence, then Margaret said, half? Yes. You understand what happened last night? I do. Every farm we called lost something. I didn't. Margaret's voice became suspicious. How? Protected production. That answer was vague enough to be useless and plausible enough to survive. Margaret sighed. What price? Daniel named it. 30% higher than their existing agreement. She accepted immediately. Daniel could have demanded double, perhaps triple. He did not. Within 2 hours, Harrison's trucks were arriving. By noon, grocery stores were calling. Restaurants followed. The hotel in the city doubled its order. A hospital cafeteria requested potatoes and carrots. Samuel stood inside the office with invoices spread across his desk. His hands shook. Do you know how much we've sold? Daniel continued signing delivery slips. Yes, $4,300. Not collected yet. Most of it is cash or guaranteed commercial payment. Daniel nodded. Samuel leaned closer. The bank wants $9,000, I remember. We might actually do it. Daniel finally looked up. We will. The first day ended with almost $5,000 in new sales. Daniel returned to the magic space after midnight and harvested again. He barely slept. On the second morning, shortages became worse. Farmers who had planned to supply late-season vegetables had nothing usable. Briggs's warehouse received less than a third of its expected inventory. His customers began calling Daniel. Daniel accepted some, rejected others. Briggs's largest grocery client received a polite offer requiring payment in advance. They agreed. That one sale hurt Briggs more than Daniel expected. By noon, Briggs arrived at Samuel's warehouse. He did not enter. He sat in his pickup across the road watching trucks come and go. Daniel saw him through the window. Samuel followed his gaze. He looks like he wants to kill you. He already tried intimidation, and it increased my sales. Samuel laughed. Briggs remained there almost an hour. Then he drove away. At 3, the bank manager called. Samuel answered, his face tightened. Then he handed Daniel the receiver. They want to speak with you. Daniel took it. Thomas Vale's voice came through the line. Mr. Carter. Mr. is generous. Vale ignored that. I understand you're operating from Mr. Price's warehouse. I rent space. I also understand you intend to satisfy his outstanding loan. On what? Daniel looked at Samuel. Whether the bank intends to honor its own paperwork. Silence. Vale's voice cooled. The loan is due in approximately 30 hours. Then why did 2 men from your bank arrive this morning to inventory equipment before default? Another silence. Daniel smiled. Samuel had told him. The bank was preparing to seize the warehouse early, not legal seizure. Pressure. Daniel had seen the tactic many times in his first life. Make a struggling borrower believe the outcome was inevitable, then force a cheap settlement. Vale spoke carefully. You seem unusually knowledgeable for your age, I read. I think you should let Mr. Price handle his own affairs. I think Mr. Price should know why Harold Briggs visited your office yesterday. Samuel's head snapped toward him. Daniel had not actually seen Briggs visit. He had inferred it. The bank's sudden aggression appeared immediately after Daniel threatened Briggs. Vale's silence confirmed everything. Daniel's smile vanished. There it was. Briggs had pressured the bank, perhaps promised future business, perhaps called in a favor. It did not matter. Now Daniel knew who sat on which side of the table. I'll see you tomorrow, Daniel said. He hung up. Samuel stared at him. Briggs went to the bank? Yes. How do you know? Just told me. He didn't say that. He didn't need to. By evening, Daniel had collected enough cash and certified payments to reach $7,600. Still short. The deadline was the following afternoon. Daniel needed $1,400 more. The third morning brought an unexpected problem. The county health inspector arrived, then an agricultural officer, then a tax representative. All Samuel looked ready to explode. Daniel did not. Briggs had finally chosen bureaucracy. Smart, if he could not destroy Daniel's supply, he could slow it. The inspectors checked storage, invoices, sanitation, delivery records. Daniel had anticipated that eventually. He had not anticipated it this soon. Most things were in order. One thing was not: production records. The agricultural officer looked through Daniel's paperwork. "You're claiming these vegetables come from family acreage?" "Yes." "How many acres?" Daniel gave a number. The officer frowned. "That yield doesn't make sense." Daniel remained calm. "Greenhouse production." "I'd like to inspect it." There was the danger. Daniel could not take anyone to the magic space. The actual Carter farm was too small and too primitive to explain the volume moving through the warehouse. Daniel had known he would eventually need a physical cover. He simply had not expected to need it today. "When this afternoon?" Daniel smiled. "Tomorrow." The officer shook his head. "Today." Daniel looked at the clock. The bank deadline was also today. Two crises. One solution. He turned toward Samuel. "Call Frank." 20 minutes later, Daniel was riding toward the northern edge of Millbrook. There stood an abandoned commercial greenhouse complex built by a flower grower who had gone bankrupt the previous year. 6 glass structures. A small packing shed, nearly 11 acres. The property belonged to First Millbrook Commercial Bank. Daniel knew because he had asked Samuel about it weeks earlier. The bank wanted $6,000. Nobody wanted to buy. Broken glass covered portions of the greenhouses. Heating equipment was old. Weeds filled the surrounding land. To everyone else, it was another failed agricultural property. To Daniel, it was camouflage. He entered First Millbrook Commercial at 11:17 carrying a briefcase. Thomas Vale sat beside a polished desk. Briggs was already in the room. Daniel almost smiled. Neither man expected him. Briggs recovered first. "Come to beg?" Daniel placed the briefcase on the desk. He opened it. Bundles of cash filled the interior. Samuel had contributed his remaining savings. Daniel had emptied nearly every dollar from his business account. The morning deliveries had provided the final amount. $9,000. Vale stared. Daniel slid Samuel Price's loan documents across the desk. "Paid in full." Briggs' face changed. Vale did not move. Daniel continued. "I want written confirmation that the lien is released." Vale looked toward Briggs. A mistake. But Daniel saw it. He leaned back. Vale frowned. "What?" "You looked at him before answering a question about your bank." Briggs stood. "Watch yourself." Daniel ignored him. Vale slowly gathered the documents. "The bank will process the payment. Today it takes time." Daniel pushed the cash closer. "Then count faster." Briggs's face became dark. Daniel turned toward him. "You should have taken 4,000 for the Eastern warehouse." Briggs laughed bitterly. "You don't have 4,000 now." "Correct," Daniel smiled. "I spent it surviving your trap." He looked at Vale. "And while we're discussing bank property, I want the abandoned greenhouse complex on North Ridge Road." Vale blinked. Briggs stopped smiling. 6,000. 3. "That's ridiculous. It has been empty for 14 months. 5. 3,500. Vale shook his head. Daniel closed the briefcase. "Then keep paying taxes on broken glass." He stood. Vale stopped him. 4,000. Daniel turned. 3,500. Briggs suddenly stepped forward. "I'll pay 4." Daniel looked at him. Briggs smiled. He did not want the property. He wanted to stop Daniel from acquiring it. Vale looked between them. Daniel shrugged. "Sell it to him." Briggs's smile weakened. Daniel moved toward the door. He offered 4,000. "Take it." Briggs realized the trap. If he withdrew, he looked weak. If he bought, he spent desperately needed cash on useless property. Daniel reached the door. "Unless Mr. Briggs doesn't actually have 4,000. Samuel would later say the silence that followed was worth more than the warehouse. Briggs's face turned purple, but he could not spend the money. Not now. His creditors were already circling. Daniel looked back at Vale. 3,500. Vale exhaled. "Done." Daniel smiled. He had just bought 11 acres, 6 greenhouses, 2 barns, and a packing shed for less than the price of an ordinary truck. More importantly, he had bought an explanation. By 3 that afternoon, the agricultural officer was walking through Daniel's new greenhouse property. Workers had already begun clearing debris. Frank had moved crates into the packing shed. Several intact greenhouse rows held plants Daniel had transferred from the magic space only an hour earlier. The officer examined the tomatoes, then the lettuce, then the strawberries. "How are these producing after last night?" Daniel touched one of the greenhouse pipes. "Heat retention." The officer looked around. The system was old, but technically possible. "Impressive." Daniel smiled. He had learned something valuable. The magic space could produce. Reality only needed to explain. The inspection ended without violation. By sunset, Daniel stood alone inside the largest greenhouse. Outside, winter wind struck the glass. Inside, rows of perfect vegetables waited beneath the dim light. He now owned the warehouse through Samuel's cleared debt arrangement. He controlled a greenhouse property. He had major customers. He had land beside the future highway. And after settling everything, he still had several $100s in operating cash. 3 weeks earlier, his family had possessed $10.37. His mother had been afraid of winter. His father had been dying. Now the Carter family controlled assets worth more than most people in Millbrook earned in years. Yet Daniel knew this was still nothing. His real advantage was not money, not even the magic space. It was momentum. Once money began moving correctly, it attracted more money. Once suppliers trusted you, they brought opportunities. Once customers depended on you, competitors lost leverage. And once frightened enemies began making emotional decisions, they destroyed themselves. Harold Briggs was already doing exactly that. That night, Briggs made his fourth mistake. Daniel woke shortly after 2 in the morning. At first, he thought the orange glow beyond his bedroom window was sunrise. Then he smelled smoke. He ran outside. The northern horizon burned red. Not the Carter farm. Not Samuel's warehouse, the new greenhouse complex. Daniel jumped onto Frank's truck and drove through the darkness. By the time he arrived, one of the 6 greenhouses was engulfed in flames. Glass exploded under the heat. Workers formed a bucket line. Firefighters struggled to prevent the blaze from reaching the packing shed. Daniel stood beside the road, watching thousands of dollars in property burn. Samuel arrived behind him. Briggs, Daniel said nothing. Samuel grabbed his arm. "We have to call Lawson." Daniel watched another section of glass collapse. Then his eyes moved toward the tire tracks beside the rear fence. Fresh, heavy. A vehicle had entered from the service road. Daniel crouched. Near the tracks lay a small brass object. He picked it up, a customized cigar cutter. On one side were engraved 2 letters. H.B. Samuel saw them. His face changed. "We've got him." Daniel closed his hand around the metal. "No?" Samuel stared. "What do you mean?" Daniel looked at the burning greenhouse. "If Briggs goes to jail, the bank takes what he owns." The flames reflected in Daniel's eyes. "I don't want the bank to have it." Samuel slowly understood. Daniel put the cigar cutter into his pocket. "I want him desperate enough to sell it to me first." Behind them, the greenhouse roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Harold Briggs believed he had burned Daniel's business. Instead, he had just handed Daniel the weapon that could take his entire empire. By sunrise, the fire was out. One greenhouse had been reduced to a black skeleton. Another had lost half its glass. The packing shed survived. So did most of Daniel's stored produce. That was the first thing Harold Briggs had misunderstood. He believed the greenhouse complex was Daniel's source. In reality, it was only a stage. The real farm existed somewhere Briggs could never reach. Daniel stood among the smoking beams, while Deputy Lawson examined the rear service road. The cigar cutter was already inside Daniel's coat. He had not mentioned it. Not yet. Lawson crouched beside the tire tracks. "Could be anybody." Daniel nodded. "Could be you have enemies." Samuel snorted behind him. Lawson ignored that. Daniel looked at the ruins. "Business competitors. Anyone specific?" "No proof." That answer surprised Samuel. After Lawson left, he grabbed Daniel by the shoulder. "You have his initials on a cigar cutter. I have an object anyone could have dropped. You know it was Briggs." "Yes." "Then why protect him?" "I'm not protecting him." He looked toward the eastern horizon. "I'm protecting his assets from becoming evidence before they become mine." Samuel stared. Daniel began walking toward the surviving greenhouse. "Get the workers together." "For what?" "Repairs." Samuel looked at the wreckage. "Repairs? We have orders. You just lost a greenhouse." Daniel glanced back. "I lost glass." He opened the greenhouse door. "I did not lose production." Within an hour, trucks were moving again. Customers expecting shortages received their deliveries on time. That mattered more than the fire. Rumors spread through Millbrook before breakfast. Daniel Carter's greenhouse had burned. Briggs' regular customers expected Daniel's supply to collapse. Instead, Harrison received every crate promised. So did the hospital. So did 3 grocery stores. By noon, the story changed. Someone had burned Daniel Carter's greenhouse, and the boy had continued delivering as though nothing happened. That was far more dangerous to Briggs than sympathy. It created myth. People began saying Daniel could not be stopped. Farmers who had hesitated to work with him called Samuel. 2 restaurants signed monthly agreements. A regional produce buyer requested a meeting. The fire meant to frighten customers had convinced them Daniel was reliable. Samuel watched new orders arrive. This is insane. Daniel signed another invoice. No. He looked toward the burned building. This is what happens when someone attacks the visible part of a business without understanding what actually makes it work. The next blow landed that afternoon, not against Daniel, against Briggs. A grain supplier from the neighboring county refused to extend him 30 days of credit. Then another demanded payment before delivery. Briggs's liquidity crisis became impossible to hide. He had warehouses full of equipment and property, but land could not pay tomorrow's invoice unless someone bought it. Daniel understood the weakness perfectly. He had seen wealthy companies die while owning millions in assets. Cash flow killed them first. At 4:30, Daniel walked into Briggs' agricultural supply. This time, nobody tried to stop him. The office outside Briggs' room was almost empty. Two clerks whispered beside a filing cabinet. A telephone rang unanswered. Daniel opened the inner door. Harold Briggs stood beside the window. "You." Daniel closed the door. Briggs turned. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his face, only exhaustion. Daniel placed the cigar cutter on the desk. The tiny brass object clicked against the wood. Briggs stopped breathing. Daniel watched his eyes. That reaction was enough. "You dropped something." Briggs looked at the cutter, then at Daniel. "I don't know what that is." "Of course not." Daniel sat without being invited. Briggs remained standing. "You planning to go to the sheriff?" No, the answer frightened him more. Daniel could see it. Briggs slowly sat. "What do you want?" Daniel removed a sheet of paper from his coat. "The Eastern warehouse." Briggs laughed bitterly. "You don't have enough." "The truck depot." The laugh stopped. "In the storage building beside the railway." Briggs stared. Daniel continued. "In exchange, this disappears." He touched the cigar cutter. Briggs stood so quickly his chair struck the wall. "You little bastard." Daniel remained seated. "You burned my property. You can't prove that." "I don't need to." Daniel leaned back. "The sheriff might not arrest you with this alone, but your creditors will hear about it. Your bank will hear about it. Your insurance company will hear about it." Briggs's face tightened. "Then they start asking questions." Daniel's voice became quieter. "They inspect your books." That hit. Daniel saw it immediately. There was something in those books, something Daniel had not known. Briggs stepped forward. Daniel smiled. "For what?" "For confirming that I should ask about your books." Briggs froze. Daniel had not known. Now he did. His older self had made fortunes by watching reactions during negotiations. People lied with words. Bodies were less disciplined. Daniel stood. "My offer expires tomorrow morning." "You think I'm giving you half my business?" "No." Daniel picked up the cigar cutter. "I think tomorrow morning you'll realize half is better than none." He left. Samuel was waiting outside. "What? He'll refuse." "Then why did we come?" Daniel looked toward First Millbrook Commercial Bank. "To make sure he spends tonight thinking about what I know." Fear worked best when the victim supplied his own imagination. That evening, Daniel entered the magic space carrying something different. Not seeds, books, agricultural manuals, catalogs, business directories. He had begun using the wooden cabin as an office. Inside one room, he stored account books. Inside another, seed inventory. The space had become more organized every day. But Daniel had discovered another mystery. The cabin was changing. The first time he entered, there had been 3 rooms. Now there were 4. The newest room appeared behind a door Daniel swore had not existed the previous week. Inside were wooden shelves and several empty clay containers. Nothing else. Daniel inspected them. No markings, no explanation. He filled one container with potatoes harvested from the field. Then he left. Hours later, when he returned, the potatoes looked exactly the same, not slightly wilted. Not cooler, exactly the same. Daniel waited another day. No change. The containers preserved whatever entered them. That discovery solved another problem. Storage. Perishable goods could remain inside indefinitely. Daniel's entire supply chain had just become stronger. He sat beside the stream and looked across the fields. The magic space continued revealing itself slowly. Perhaps it had more secrets. Perhaps he had not even discovered its true purpose. But Daniel refused to depend on miracles he did not understand. The space was leverage. His mind was the weapon. The next morning, Harold Briggs did not call. Daniel expected that. At 9:15, Daniel called the county records office. At 9:40, he visited the bank. At 10:30, he met 2 of Briggs' creditors. By lunchtime, Harold Briggs' situation became worse. Daniel had not lied. He simply asked questions. Was Briggs current on his notes? Were his properties cross-collateralized? Was equipment owned outright? Was there outstanding tax liability? Bankers hated uncertainty. Creditors hated it more. At 2, one creditor demanded additional security. At 3, Briggs called Daniel. Come alone. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. Briggs looked destroyed. 3 empty coffee cups sat on the desk. No cigar. The curtains were closed. He slid documents forward. Eastern warehouse. Truck depot. Another document. Rail storage. Another. Daniel examined everything carefully. Briggs's hands were trembling. Price? Briggs named $12,000. Daniel almost smiled. Yesterday, he had demanded those assets for silence. Today, Briggs was still trying to sell them. 610. 6. Daniel stood. Briggs slammed his fist down. 7,500. Daniel sat again. 6,000, and I assume the equipment lease is attached to the depot. Briggs stared. That was better than Daniel's first offer. But only slightly. 7,6. Briggs. Daniel waited. Silence was expensive. People paid to escape it. Finally, Briggs whispered 6,500. Daniel extended his hand. Done. Briggs hesitated, then shook it. Daniel did not have $6,500. Not in cash, but he had something better. Purchase orders, signed customer contracts, inventory, property, and a bank president who had just watched Daniel pay $9,000 before a deadline everyone expected him to miss. Daniel returned to First Millbrook Commercial. Vale looked uncomfortable when he entered. I need a loan. The banker almost laughed. How much? 7,000. You're 17. You knew that when you sold me the greenhouse. Collateral? Daniel placed Harrison's contract on the desk. Then the deed to the greenhouse property. Then the deed to the county road land. Then his sales records. Vale stopped smiling. Daniel spoke calmly. 7,000. 90 days. Vale examined the numbers. Daniel knew what he saw. Revenue. Assets. Customers. More importantly, repayment capability. Vale named a painful interest rate. Daniel negotiated it down. Daniel stood. I'll ask the county bank. Vale stopped him. They settled. By 4 that afternoon, Daniel had financing. By 5, the papers were signed. At 17 years old, less than a month after borrowing $5 from his mother, Daniel Carter controlled a commercial greenhouse complex, a warehouse operation, a truck depot, railway storage, 32 acres of future development land, and a rapidly expanding food distribution company. Samuel stood inside the eastern warehouse, staring at the keys. This used to be Briggs's. Yes. You realize what you did? Daniel walked through the loading area. Rows of empty shelving stretched before him. Trucks could enter directly from the rear yard. A rail spur sat less than 200 yards away. Perfect, Samuel laughed. He tried to destroy you. Daniel touched one of the steel support columns and financed my expansion instead. But Harold Briggs was not finished. Desperate men rarely surrendered gracefully. That night, Daniel returned home and found a strange car parked near the farmhouse. His mother stood in the doorway. Her face was tense. There are men inside. Daniel entered. 2 strangers sat at the kitchen table. One wore a dark suit. The other carried a leather briefcase. His father sat opposite them. Daniel recognized neither. The suited man stood. Daniel Carter? My name is Richard Hayes. He presented a card. State Revenue Department. Daniel's eyes became cold. Hayes opened the briefcase. We've received allegations concerning unreported commercial income, fraudulent agricultural records, and unexplained property purchases. Briggs. Of course. Daniel pulled out a chair, then investigate. Hayes studied him. You don't seem worried. I keep records. We'll need access to them. You'll have it. And we may need to verify your production. Daniel remained calm, but inside something tightened. The greenhouse explanation had survived a county inspector. A state investigation was different. Hayes continued. We'll inspect your financial records, properties, suppliers, and production sites. His mother looked frightened. Daniel placed one hand on the table. Fine. Hayes closed the briefcase. We begin Monday. After the men left, Daniel's father spoke. Is this Briggs? Can he hurt us? Daniel looked toward his mother. Emily wrote. The warm stove, the house he had sworn nobody would ever take again. No. His answer was immediate. But Daniel knew the truth. For the first time since returning, his enemy had attacked the one thing he could not easily explain. The money was real. The customers were real. The properties were real. But the production behind everything was impossible. If state investigators calculated his yields carefully, they would discover that Daniel Carter was selling more food than his visible farmland should ever be capable of producing. He had 3 days to create an explanation for a miracle. Then Rose entered the kitchen carrying an envelope. This came for you. Daniel opened it. Inside was no letter, only a photograph, his burned greenhouse. On the back, 4 words had been written in black ink. Next time your house. Daniel stared at the message. His expression changed. Until now, Briggs had attacked business, warehouses, trucks. That could be forgiven in negotiation. This could not. Daniel folded the photograph and placed it inside his pocket. His father saw his face. What are you going to do? Daniel looked toward the dark road outside. In his first life, he had spent decades regretting that he had been too weak to protect his family. He had not returned to repeat that mistake, finish it. And across town, Harold Briggs sat inside the last warehouse he still owned, believing the threat would finally frighten the Carter boy into retreat. He did not know Daniel had already decided that by the end of the week, Harold Briggs would no longer own enough property in Millbrook to threaten anyone. Daniel did not go to Harold Briggs that night. That was what Briggs expected. A frightened boy would storm across town. A reckless boy would bring the photograph to the sheriff. An emotional boy would make threats. Daniel had already lived long enough to bury men who made decisions while angry. So he did something much worse. He went home. He ate dinner with his family. He helped Rose with arithmetic. He listened while Emily complained about a girl at school. Then, after everyone went to sleep, Daniel entered the magic space and sat inside the wooden cabin with Briggs' photograph on the table. Next time, your house. Daniel stared at those words until his anger became calculation. Then he opened a notebook. Harold Briggs still owned 3 valuable things: his main grain warehouse, a fleet of trucks, and his relationships with farmers across the county. Daniel intended to take all 3. But first he had to survive Monday's state investigation. The investigators would compare visible acreage with sales volume. That was dangerous. Daniel could not create hundreds of acres overnight. But he did not need to. He needed legitimate suppliers. By dawn, he had a plan. Saturday morning, Daniel drove into the countryside. He visited farmers Briggs had neglected. Not wealthy farmers, struggling ones, men with damaged crops, families carrying bank debt, small operators who had spent years accepting Briggs's prices because nobody else collected from their farms. Daniel offered something simple: guaranteed purchase contracts, cash within 7 days, transportation included, fair grading, no hidden deductions. The first farmer laughed at him. The second listened. The third signed. By noon, 5 had joined. By sunset, 14. Daniel did not actually need their entire harvest. His magic space could supply more food than all of them combined. What he needed were invoices, delivery records, real agricultural relationships, real farms producing real crops. From that day forward, ordinary supply would enter Daniel's warehouses alongside produce from the magic space. The miracle would disappear inside scale. Samuel understood immediately. You're building a legitimate supply network around the impossible one. Daniel looked at him. Samuel paused. Whatever your actual production method is, Daniel smiled. Exactly. Samuel had stopped asking. That loyalty earned him something Daniel had already decided to give. He placed a contract on the desk. Samuel read it, then looked up. What is this? 20% of what? The distribution company. Samuel stared at him. Daniel continued. You gave me warehouse space when I had almost nothing. You paid rent. You stood beside me when Briggs sent men. Samuel looked back at the contract. I can't buy this. I'm not selling it. Silent. Samuel's eyes hardened unexpectedly. I don't take charity. Neither do I. Daniel leaned forward. I'm buying loyalty before someone richer tries to. Samuel stared at him for a long time, then laughed. You really are an old bastard. Daniel smiled. He did. Sunday evening, Daniel gathered every invoice, contract, receipt, tax record, bank statement, and property document. He arranged them chronologically. He created supplier summaries. He prepared yield explanations for greenhouse production. He even documented damaged crops purchased from farmers and sorted through his warehouse. By midnight, his records looked better than businesses 10 times his size. At 8 Monday morning, Richard Hayes returned with 2 state investigators. They began at the warehouse. They checked inventory, then invoices. Hayes asked questions for 3 hours. Daniel answered everyone. Why did your revenue increase so quickly? Shortage. How did you maintain supply during the freeze? Greenhouse production and diversified suppliers. You recently added 14 farms. Yes, very convenient timing. Daniel looked at him. Very inconvenient weather. Hayes did not smile. At noon, they drove to North Ridge. The investigators walked through every greenhouse. Daniel had spent the weekend repairing enough glass to make the site look operational. Workers moved among rows of vegetables. Some were ordinary crops. Others had been transplanted from the magic space. Hayes examined everything. Then he asked the dangerous question. Your reported sales still seem high. Daniel nodded. They are, for this acreage, yes. Hayes waited. Daniel pointed toward a row of crates. I buy from independent farmers. We have those records. I also sort and redistribute. We know. And some produce comes from controlled growing. Hayes looked around. How controlled? Daniel smiled faintly. That's the part I consider proprietary. Hayes's eyes narrowed. You expect the state to accept that? I expect the state to collect the taxes I legally owe. Daniel handed him a ledger. If you find unpaid taxes, tell me. Hayes opened it, everything balanced. That was Daniel's strongest defense. He was not hiding income. He was not hiding purchases. He was not forging tax payments. The state could find his production unusual. Unusual was not illegal. By late afternoon, the investigators had found nothing actionable. Hayes closed his briefcase. Someone made serious accusations. Daniel looked at him. Hayes did not answer. Daniel smiled. That was enough. As the investigators walked toward their car, one of them paused. Those strawberries. Daniel looked at him. What about them? My wife bought some last week. The man smiled despite himself. Best I've ever had. Daniel nodded. Tell her we appreciate the business. Hayes looked irritated. Daniel watched their car disappear. Then Samuel exhaled so loudly it became a laugh. That's it? For now, we survived? Daniel turned toward the road. No, Samuel frowned. We stopped defending. 30 minutes later, Daniel walked into the sheriff's office. He placed the photograph on Lawson's desk, then the cigar cutter. Lawson examined both. His expression changed. When did you find this? The morning of the fire. And you waited? I wanted legal advice. Not entirely false. Daniel had spent 50 years learning when evidence became useful. Lawson looked at the photograph again. This came after the fire? Yes. Anyone else touch it? My sister handled the envelope. Lawson leaned back. This is serious. It should be. Why bring it now? Daniel met his eyes. Because the threat is against my family. That part was entirely true. Lawson opened a drawer and placed the evidence inside. I'll speak to Briggs. Daniel stood. No need to tell me what happens. Lawson looked surprised. Daniel left. He did not need Briggs arrested immediately. He needed Briggs publicly cornered. By Tuesday morning, word spread that the sheriff had questioned Harold Briggs about the greenhouse fire. By noon, his bank called one of his commercial notes. By 2, two farmers terminated agreements. At 4, Briggs's largest insurance provider announced it was reviewing coverage. Then came the blow Daniel had been waiting for. First Millbrook Commercial refused to renew Briggs's revolving credit line. Without that line, he could not buy enough grain for the winter season. His business was suffocating. At 5:30, Briggs arrived at Daniel's warehouse. Alone, he looked smaller. His coat was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot. Samuel started toward him. Daniel raised a hand. Let him in. Briggs entered the office. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he placed a folder on the desk. Daniel opened it. Main grain warehouse, 7 trucks, 2 loading tractors. 3 grain silos, office equipment, customer accounts. Daniel slowly looked up. What's this? You know what? Price, $30,000. Daniel closed the folder. No. Briggs' jaw tightened. Those assets are worth twice that. Then sell them to someone else. I came to you. That was your mistake. Briggs gripped the chair. Daniel remained calm. You threatened my house. I didn't send that photograph. Daniel stared at him. Briggs looked away. Another answer without words. Daniel opened the folder again. 12,000. Briggs laughed in disbelief. You're insane. 12. 25. Daniel closed the folder. Briggs slammed both hands on the desk. Do you understand what I built? Yes. 20 years. And you nearly destroyed it in 20 days. The words landed harder than a punch. Briggs stood motionless. Daniel continued. You could have ignored me. You were taking my customers. I was selling vegetables. You were coming for me from the beginning. Daniel smiled faintly. That was true. Briggs finally understood. You knew Mercer would collapse. Daniel said nothing. You knew the freeze was coming. Silence. You knew about the highway land. That surprised Daniel. Briggs had discovered something. His eyes sharpened. What highway? Briggs watched him. Then smiled for the first time. There Daniel had reacted. Barely. Briggs leaned forward. I heard surveyors have been working near County Road 9. History was moving faster. The highway project was not supposed to become publicly interesting yet. Daniel recalculated immediately. If Briggs confirmed the route, the swampland's value would rise before Daniel was ready. Briggs saw the silence and mistook it for fear. That's why you bought it. Daniel shrugged. Maybe I like mosquitoes. Briggs laughed. You're hiding something. Daniel stood. And you're bankrupt. The smile vanished. 14,000 for everything in the folder. 20, 14, 18. Daniel reached for his coat. 16. Daniel paused. 14 was already a brutal bargain. 16 was still excellent. But Daniel wanted one more thing. 14,000 in your supplier contracts. Briggs cursed. 15 in contracts. Daniel extended his hand. Done. Briggs stared at it, then shook. His empire ended with that handshake. The financing took 2 days. Daniel used warehouse assets as collateral, customer contracts as proof of revenue, and Samuel's improved balance sheet to secure commercial credit. The bank resisted. Daniel brought competing terms from another lender. Vail immediately became cooperative. By Friday afternoon, the transfer was complete. Harold Briggs walked out of the grain warehouse carrying one cardboard box. 20 years of power reduced to papers, a family photograph, and 2 cigars. Workers watched silently. Some hated him, some pitied him. Daniel did neither. Briggs stopped beside him. You think you beat me? Daniel looked at the warehouse now, carrying Carter distribution paperwork. I bought your company. With Des. You'll choke on it. Maybe. Briggs stepped closer. You don't know what comes next. Daniel almost smiled. That was the one thing Briggs could never understand. Daniel knew exactly what came next. He knew the next recession, the next fuel shortage, the supermarket expansion, the interstate, the industrial park, the real estate boom. He knew which companies would dominate America. He knew which technologies would reshape commerce. He knew where wealth would flow for the next half-century. Briggs had lost to a 17-year-old, but the 17-year-old was only the body. Behind those eyes stood a businessman with 50 years of tomorrow already memorized. Daniel watched Briggs leave. Samuel approached. So what now? Daniel looked across the warehouse. Trucks, storeworkers, contracts, infrastructure. Everything he had once needed decades to build. Now he had assembled it in weeks. But his family fortune still depended on one fragile region. That was not enough. Daniel opened a map on the desk. He placed one finger on Millbrook, then another on the nearest major city. We stopped selling like farmers. Samuel frowned. What does that mean? We become retailers. Daniel nodded. Samuel laughed. We just bought a distribution company. That's why we're ready. Daniel pointed toward 3 neighborhoods on the map. In the next 5 years, families will move into these areas. How do you roads? It was only part of the truth. Daniel remembered the suburbs. He remembered where supermarkets appeared. He remembered which small stores survived and which disappeared. If he moved now, he could buy sites before anyone understood their value. He would control farms, warehouses, then retail. Vertical integration decades before most of Millbrook understood the phrase. That evening, Daniel returned home, carrying something his family had never owned. A brand new television. Rose screamed. Emily ran outside thinking someone had delivered it to the wrong house. His mother nearly demanded he return it. His father simply sat in his chair laughing. Daniel plugged it in. Static filled the screen. Then the picture appeared. The family gathered close. Daniel stood behind them. His mother, his father, his sisters. Alive. Fed. Safe. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to enjoy what he had created. Then a knock came at the door. Samuel stood outside holding a newspaper. His expression was strange. You need to see this. He handed it over. A small article appeared near the bottom of the front page. State Transportation Department reviewing Millbrook Corridor for future highway expansion. Daniel read it twice. Too early. This announcement had appeared years later in his original life. His interference had changed the timeline. Samuel pointed toward County Road 9. That swamp you bought. Daniel looked at him. People are already asking about it. How much? One developer offered 20,000. Daniel had paid 2,000. His mother overheard. She nearly dropped a plate. $20,000? Daniel folded the newspaper. He could sell now and multiply his money 10 times. Most people would. Daniel would not. Because he remembered what that land could become. And now that history was changing, it might become valuable even faster. He looked at Samuel. Reject it. 20,000? Yes. What would make you sell? Daniel walked toward the kitchen table and spread out the map. His finger landed on the future interchange, then on his 32 acres, then on several neighboring farms. I don't want to sell the land. He looked toward the dark fields outside. I want to own everything around it before the rest of the county understands what is happening. The next morning, Daniel entered the bank with less than $1,000 in free cash, enormous new debt, and a plan to purchase hundreds of acres. Everyone else saw a teenager who had expanded too quickly. Daniel saw the first foundation of a fortune that would outlive him. And this time, That fortune would not belong to the son who murdered him in another lifetime. It would belong to the family sitting around that little television. The family he had come back from death to save. The bank manager thought Daniel Carter had finally lost his mind. Thomas Vale sat behind his polished desk, staring at the map Daniel had spread across the table. More than 200 acres had been circled in pencil. Most of it was farmland. Some was woodland. Several parcels were so wet during spring that even cattle avoided them. Vale removed his glasses. You just borrowed heavily to acquire Briggs' assets. I know. You still owe money on the greenhouse operation. I know. You want another loan. Yes, to buy land that currently produces almost nothing. Daniel smiled. Vale leaned back. No. Daniel had expected that answer. He gathered the map. Vale frowned. That's it? Yes, you're not going to argue? Not when somebody else owns money. Daniel stood. I'll ask someone who understands collateral. Vale watched him reach the door. Which bank? Daniel turned. The count was a bluff. Mostly. Daniel knew the county bank's president had recently begun looking for commercial clients. He also knew First Millbrook Commercial had already made money from Daniel's rapid expansion. Losing him now would mean losing deposits, business accounts, future financing, and perhaps the entire distribution operation. Vale's pride fought his arithmetic for several seconds. Arithmetic 1. Sit down. Daniel did. Vale tapped the map. How much are you asking? 25,000. The banker nearly laughed again. Daniel placed 3 folders on the desk. The first contained Carter Distribution's latest orders. The second showed the warehouses and vehicles acquired from Briggs. The third showed the offer Daniel had already received for the county road parcel. $20,000. Vale stared at it. You rejected this? Yes, you paid $2,000. Yes. Why not sell? Because the buyer knows something. Vale's fingers stopped moving. Daniel leaned forward. If someone suddenly offers me 10 times what I paid, I don't ask how quickly I can sign. He tapped the offer. I ask why he wants it. Vale looked toward the newspaper clipping beside the map. Future highway expansion. The banker slowly understood. You think the route is coming through there. I think land near transportation becomes valuable. That was all Daniel was willing to say. Vale studied the neighboring parcels. You want to assemble the entire area? Yes. Before the route is confirmed? Yes. And if the highway goes somewhere else? Daniel met his eyes. Then I own cheap farmland. Vale smiled despite himself. You say that as though cheap farmland is a consolation prize. For me, it is. The loan took another 3 hours of negotiation. Daniel did not receive 25,000. He received 18. It was enough. Over the next 6 weeks, he bought quietly. Never through one obvious method. Samuel negotiated 2 parcels. A local attorney handled another. Daniel purchased several directly from farmers who needed cash before winter. He did not bully them. He did not repeat Briggs' tactics. When a widow named Mrs. Turner asked $3,000 for land Daniel knew was worth half that amount. In 1975, he paid her $3,000. Samuel protested. Daniel did not. In his previous life, he had learned something wealth rarely taught people until too late. A fortune built entirely from squeezing desperate people eventually created enemies faster than it created assets. Daniel wanted profit. He did not need cruelty to obtain it. By Christmas, Carter-controlled property surrounded most of the future interchange zone. His father stood beside the kitchen window, looking at deed after deed spread across the table. How much land do you own? Daniel considered question. Our family owns it. His father smiled. That wasn't what I asked. 246 acres. The old man stared at him, then laughed, a real laugh. Strong enough that he began coughing afterward. But there was no blood. Not anymore. The spring water had changed him gradually. His lungs still required care. He still took medication. But the grayness had disappeared from his skin. Some mornings, he even walked through the barn again. Daniel never allowed himself to become careless with the magic water. He used tiny amounts, enough to help, never enough to create questions. Christmas morning was nothing like the one Daniel remembered. In his first life, his father had already been dead. Their house had been cold. His mother had tried to create a holiday meal from potatoes and flour. Rose had received no present. Emily had pretended not to care. Daniel had spent most of the day outside because he could not bear watching his mother hide her grief. This time the farmhouse smelled of roast chicken. Coal filled the shed. A pine tree stood beside the window. Rose received a doll. Emily received books and a new winter coat. Daniel's mother opened a small velvet box and immediately covered her mouth. Inside was her wedding ring. Not the original. That ring had never been sold in this timeline. Daniel had bought her a second one. His father looked at Daniel. "You're going to spoil everybody." Daniel smiled. "That's cheaper than regretting it." Nobody understood the weight behind those words. They did not need to. Outside, snow covered the Carter farm. Inside the magic space, strawberries continued to rain beneath eternal golden light. Daniel's first $10 had become land, warehouses, vehicles, contracts, and security. But the true explosion came the following spring. Survey crews appeared along County Road 9, then engineers, then state vehicles. Daniel watched them without reacting. Everyone else reacted enough for him. Landowners who had ignored the transportation article suddenly refused to sell. Developers began arriving, first quietly, then aggressively. A regional company offered Daniel $80,000 for his original 32-acre parcel. He refused. They returned with $120,000. Daniel refused. $150,000. Samuel looked physically ill when Daniel rejected it. "You paid $2,000, I remember. They're offering $150,000. I heard them. What number are you waiting for?" Daniel pointed toward the map. "None." Samuel stared. Daniel moved his finger from the future interchange to the warehouse corridor. "We're not selling. Then why did we buy it to build?" The new highway route was officially confirmed in July 1976. Property values exploded. Daniel did not sell. Instead, he divided selected parcels. He leased frontage to a fuel station. He leased another section to a motel operator. He kept the land beneath both. Then he began construction on something Millbrook had never seen: a large modern grocery store. Wide aisles, bright lighting, fresh produce displayed near the entrance. A bakery, meat department, cold storage connected directly to Daniel's distribution network. Samuel stood inside the unfinished building. "You really planned this when we were selling lettuce from crates?" "Yes." "You're lying," Daniel laughed. "Probably." They opened Carter Market in the spring of 1977. The parking lot filled before noon. Families drove from neighboring towns. Prices remained competitive because Daniel controlled multiple layers of the supply chain. His own farms and partner farms supplied ordinary produce. The magic space quietly supplied premium volume when needed. Carter Distribution moved everything through Carter warehouses. Carter trucks delivered to Carter stores. Fewer middlemen meant lower costs and stronger margins. Within a year, a second location opened, then a third. Daniel turned 20. His family was no longer poor, not merely comfortable rich. But he refused to let wealth separate them. His mother still lived in the farmhouse until Daniel finally convinced her that a new house did not mean abandoning the old one. His father became chairman of absolutely nothing. That was the title he demanded. Instead, he walked through the original farm whenever his health allowed and complained about Daniel spending too much money. Emily studied accounting. Rose became obsessed with animals and announced she wanted to become a veterinarian. Daniel paid for their education without hesitation. Then history gave him another opportunity. The fuel crisis changed transportation costs. Competitors struggled. Daniel had remembered it. Months earlier, he had already begun consolidating delivery routes and securing long-term fuel arrangements. Carter Distribution suffered, but less than everyone else. Once again, surviving a crisis created customers. By 1980, Carter Markets operated across 3 counties. By 1983, they had crossed state lines. The original $10 became a private family story. Samuel eventually framed an old $5 bill and placed it inside company headquarters. Beneath it, he added a small plaque: "The first investment." Daniel threatened to remove it. Samuel threatened to resign. The bill remained. Harold Briggs disappeared from Millbrook for several years. Daniel heard rumors that he had moved south. Then, one rainy morning in 1984, a receptionist entered Daniel's office. "There's a man asking for you." "Appointment?" "No name." She hesitated. "Harold Briggs." Daniel stopped writing. Nearly 9 years had passed. He looked through the office window. Below him stretched a distribution center larger than every warehouse Briggs had once owned combined. Beyond it stood trucks carrying the Carter name. Daniel could have refused. Instead, he said, "Send him in." Briggs entered wearing a cheap suit. His hair was gray. His shoulders had narrowed. Daniel felt something unexpected. Nothing, no hatred, no triumph. The monster from his youth had become an old man. Briggs sat. "I heard you're opening another 12 stores. 11, Briggs nodded. Stretched between them. Finally, he said, Daniel studied him. "You came here for a job?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because everyone else knows what happened." Daniel leaned back. "And you think I forgot?" "No." Briggs looked at the floor. "I think you won." Daniel almost laughed. His younger self might have wanted this moment. His first life self had dreamed of humiliating Briggs. But sitting here now, with his father alive, his mother happy, and his sisters building futures of their own, Daniel understood how small revenge looked beside everything he had gained. You threatened my family. I know. You burned my property. Silence, then another nod. Daniel looked at him for several seconds. I won't hire you. Briggs closed his eyes. But Samuel knows companies that need experienced warehouse managers. Briggs looked up. Daniel wrote a name on a piece of paper. I'll tell them you know logistics. Why? Daniel placed the paper on the desk. Because destroying you twice would be a waste of my time. Briggs stared at him, then slowly took the paper. He stood. At the door he stopped. You really were 17? Daniel smiled. Last time I checked. Briggs shook his head and left. Daniel never saw him again. Years passed. Carter Markets became Carter Holdings. Real estate became real estate. Citisti. Logistics became food manufacturing. Daniel invested early in technologies and companies whose importance the rest of the world had not yet understood. But he never chased every future opportunity. That had been the mistake of his first life. Back then, more had never been enough. Another building, another million, another acquisition, another victory. He had built an empire large enough to make strangers admire him and returned each night to a family that had forgotten how to love him. This time, Daniel built differently. He created trusts. He separated ownership from personal desperation. His sisters received wealth but also independence. His parents never had to worry about money again. Employees received profit sharing in major operations. Samuel became one of Daniel's closest partners and one of the wealthiest men in the state, and the old Carter farmhouse remained standing. Daniel refused every developer who wanted it. A modern house was eventually built nearby, but the farmhouse remained exactly where it had always been. The stove, the cracked table, the bedroom where Daniel had opened his eyes in 1975. He preserved them all. Decades later, on a summer evening, Daniel sat on the farmhouse porch beside his father. The old man was nearly 90. Against every expectation, he had lived. His lungs had never fully become ordinary. But between modern medicine, a comfortable life, and tiny amounts of spring water over the years, death had waited far longer than it had in the first timeline. Children ran across the lawn. Emily's grandchildren, Rose's grandchildren. Samuel's family had joined them for dinner. Cars filled the road. Laughter came from the house. Daniel's father held a glass of lemonade. You remember when we had $10? Daniel smiled. $10.37. His father laughed. You always remember the numbers. Yes. How much are you worth now? Daniel looked across the fields. The highway interchange in the distance had transformed Millbrook exactly as he remembered. Carter property surrounded it, stores, hotels, warehouses, office buildings. Entire neighborhoods had risen where swamp and scrubland once stood. Financial magazines estimated Daniel Carter's fortune in billions, but he had stopped reading those estimates years ago. I don't know. His father stared at him. You're terrible at lying, Daniel laughed. The old man became quiet. Then he looked toward the family gathered inside. You did good, Danny. 3 ordinary words. They struck harder than anything Daniel had heard in either lifetime. His father had died disappointed and frightened the first time. Daniel had carried that memory for more than 50 years. Now the same man sat beside him beneath a warm evening sky, alive. Safe, proud, Daniel lowered his head. I tried. His father placed one hand on his shoulder. That's enough. Daniel closed his eyes. For all the billions he had created, this was the fortune he had wanted. Years later, after his parents finally passed peacefully from old age, Daniel entered the magic space alone. The mysterious world had expanded enormously. What had once looked like a large field now stretched farther than he could see. Orchards covered hills. Streams crossed fertile plains. The wooden cabin had become a sprawling house filled with storage rooms. Time still moved strangely. The spring still never emptied. Daniel had spent a lifetime using the space without fully understanding why it had chosen him. That evening, he walked to the original stone basin. Something rested beside it. A small Daniel froze. It had never been there before. He opened it. Inside lay a single old coin. Nothing else. Daniel picked it up. The surface was worn smooth. Then, for the first time in all those decades, words appeared inside his mind, not written in the air, not displayed on some impossible screen. They arrived like a quiet thought belonging to someone else. Wealth was never the reward. Daniel stood motionless. The voice continued. The second life was. Then silence returned. Daniel looked at the endless fields. Slowly he laughed. Of course. He had spent years believing the magic space was the greatest gift he received. It was not. The greatest gift had been October 18, 1975. One more morning with his mother. One more Christmas with his father. One more childhood for his sisters. One more chance to understand that money was powerful only because of what it could protect. Daniel closed the wooden box. When he left the magic space, the entire Carter family was waiting for him at the estate. Children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, partners who had become family. The dining table seemed impossibly long. Rose complained that Daniel was late. Emily told him to sit down before the food became cold. Daniel smiled. In another lifetime, he had died inside a mansion surrounded by people waiting to divide his fortune. In this one, he had grown old surrounded by people arguing over who got the last piece of pie. He sat at the head of the table. For a moment, he saw two lives at once. A 17-year-old boy standing in a freezing farmhouse with $5 borrowed in his pocket. An old billionaire sitting among generations of the family that boy had refused to lose. Between those two moments stood 50 years of decisions. The first crate of lettuce, the first warehouse. The fire, the freeze Briggs. The highway, the first Carter market. Every risk, every victory. Every mistake avoided because Daniel remembered making it once before. People would later tell the story differently. Some said Daniel Carter had possessed supernatural business instincts. Others insisted he was the luckiest investor of the 20th century. Economists studied Carter holdings. Journalists wrote books about his early acquisitions. Nobody discovered the truth. Nobody learned about the endless fields hidden beyond reality. Nobody knew that the foundation of one of America's largest family fortunes had been a frightened mother opening a cabinet in 1975 and handing her 17-year-old son $5 from the last $10 the family possessed. Daniel preferred it that way. Because the miracle had never belonged to history. It belonged to them. He lifted his glass. Conversation gradually stopped. Everyone looked toward him. Daniel's eyes moved across the table. His family, his real fortune, he smiled. To $10, Emily laughed. Samuel, now white-haired, raised his glass immediately. To $10, others joined. Most of the younger generation did not understand the joke. That made Daniel smile even more. They did not need to understand poverty. That was the point. Glasses touched. Laughter returned. Outside, beyond the windows, the Carter Empire stretched across cities and states. Inside, Daniel reached for the last piece of pie before Rose could steal it. She slapped his hand. For perhaps the 1000th time, Daniel laughed. The first life had taught him how to make money. The second had taught him what money was for. And the $10 that once stood between his family and a freezing winter had become something far greater than a fortune. It had become the first brick in a future where nobody Daniel loved would ever again be sold, separated, abandoned, or buried because they were too poor to fight fate. Daniel Carter had returned to 1975 believing he needed to become rich before tragedy arrived. He succeeded. But in the end, the greatest thing he changed was not his bank account. It was who remained beside him when the story was over.